Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fred Steinman. I'm the current director of the Northern Section of the Nevada Chapter of the American Planning Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our online/Zoom brown bag. Usually the individual sections of the Nevada chapter of the American Planning Association have monthly brown bags, and usually we enjoy having those brown bags together and in person. Unfortunately, as all of you know, the current COVID-19 pandemic has kind of forced us to get creative and utilize technologies, but we still want, as the chapter, to engage with our membership and individuals who have an interest in planning and public administration here in the state of Nevada. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple quick announcements. First, we'll be recording this Nevada chapter of the American Planning Association Brown Bag Luncheon so that we can turn it into a podcast and post the video file on the chapter's website within the next couple of days. So I do ask that you remain muted, and if you do have a question, please hold your questions to the end of today's presentation. You can certainly submit your questions via the chat function in Zoom, or simply just say, I have a question, and we will hopefully manage the chaos as it may ensue after the presentation. Also wanted to let you know that this will not be our last online Zoom brown bag for the chapter. We have another brown bag in the planning stages scheduled for Wednesday, May 27th from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. regarding the potential impacts of COVID-19 on the state fiscal system and the fiscal systems and revenue streams of local governments throughout the state. Once I have all the information, including speaker bio and session description and all the Zoom contact call-in information, I will be sure that each one of you gets that information so that you can participate in that Zoom brown bag as well. We'll also be scheduling 2 additional brown bags via Zoom for June. Those dates are still a little soft, but we hope to have those taken care of and planned within the next couple weeks. The Nevada chapter of the American Planning Association, several of our state officers, section officers, and members are also working on the development of a roundtable to discuss the potential impacts of COVID-19 on the chapter moving forward, as well as the larger planning and public administration community within the state of Nevada. Those details of a potential roundtable are still being planned and developed, and we'll hopefully have that material and information provided to you within the coming weeks. The brown bags that we'll be having at the end of May and through June and the roundtable in July will hopefully lead to a few sessions at the state Nevada chapter of the American Planning Association's annual conference that will be held in October later this year. The details of how we will deliver and develop that conference certainly are still in flux, but we will continue to keep you, the membership, and other interested parties informed as to the decisions of what that conference will look like once we have the details in place. With that, it is now my pleasure to present our speaker and presenter today for today's brown bag, Dan Doenges, and I'm probably destroying that last name, and I apologize if I am. Dan is the current planning manager for the Regional Transportation Commission for Washoe County, and will be presenting an overview of the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan for the Regional Transportation Commission of Washoe County. Again, during Dan's presentation, I ask that you remain muted, and then at the end of Dan's presentation via chat and via just raising your hand via Zoom, we'll hopefully have some time for questions and answers. This session is worth 1.0 AICP continuing maintenance education credits. We ask that you self-report through APA and the American Institute of Certified Planners, and the event number is available on the flyer. And if you need that information, please feel free to email me at fred, F-R-E-D, @unr.edu. I'd be happy to share that information with you. Again, my pleasure to introduce Dan to present an overview of the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan for the RTC of Washoe County. Dan.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate this opportunity and the invitation, and I'm just going to jump right into it here and hopefully grapple with this technology so that everyone can see my screen. And hopefully everyone should be seeing that. So this is kind of our front slide here, and I'm just going to jump right into it. It was good to see a lot of familiar names and faces in the participant list. My apologies, I'm trying to advance my slides. Here we go. And so I know some of you are certainly familiar with the RTC and what the agency does. I did want to just provide a brief background in case there's a few that might not be familiar, but as the name implies, we are a regional agency. We are a regional transportation planning agency. Our board is comprised of 2 members of the Washoe County Commission, 2 members of the Reno City Council, 1 member of the Sparks City Council, and also the director of NDOT as an ex officio member. And as you can see in the slide here, this is kind of the membership of our current board. Want to recently acknowledge recently too our new executive director, Bill Thomas. He's been with RTC for about a month now, and he came to us through the city of Reno. So as I mentioned, the RTC is a regional transportation planning agency, and that's really kind of the focus of the MPO, which stands for Metropolitan Planning Organization. For those of you that might not be familiar, MPOs are designated in urbanized areas with populations of 50,000 or more. So, for example, in Nevada, there are currently 4 MPOs, and they are responsible for carrying out the federal transportation planning process. They're designated by the governor, and really this allows access to federal funding to carry out this process. RTC is somewhat unique in the world of MPOs because we also are responsible for delivering projects through our street and highway construction program on what's known as the regional road network in the Truckee Meadows area. And we are also the public transportation provider for Reno Sparks. As I mentioned, we administer projects through federal funding. This could be through the Federal Highway Administration. We also get Federal Transit Administration funds. Some of this funding is passed through the Nevada Department of Transportation to the RTC, sub-allocated. We are also fortunate to have index fuel tax in Washoe County, which allows for us to do a lot of our street and highway construction projects and also carry out our pavement preservation program. And I'll get into those a little bit more. And we do receive some funding from regional road impact fees through development as well. So probably the biggest, as far as the MPO is concerned, probably the most important and significant requirement we carry out is development of the regional transportation plan. Some MPOs call it a long-range transportation plan or a metropolitan transportation plan, but essentially it's all the same thing. It's a plan that looks at a 20-year planning horizon at a minimum, and it kind of outlines the transportation policies, programs, and projects to be implemented over that horizon. We do update this every 4 years as required. And our region is also has kind of an extra layer of requirements because we are in what's known as a maintenance area for criteria air pollutants. And so any projects that we program in our plan have to be shown to not exceed what's called motor vehicle emissions budgets for our area. And so what that means is we have to meet transportation conformity. And without going too in the weeds, that's kind of designated by the EPA and as well as working with Washoe County Air Quality as part of the health district there. So we're currently under our 2040 Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP as we call it, and we are in development of our 2050 plan, as Dr. Steinman indicated, and we are looking to complete this in early 2021. The overall process is about an 18-month process, but we are kind of, 3 or 4 months into that now. We really pride ourselves on it being a very community-based process. So we receive a lot of public input. It's been a little bit of a challenge and a different way of doing business in recent times with the pandemic, but we have not slowed our outreach. We're just adapting, as most agencies are, in gathering that public input. The plan also needs to be what's called fiscally constrained. And really what that means is that all the projects that we program, we have to have revenues that are reasonably expected to be available to implement those projects. So there is a portion of the plan too that we kind of refer to as our unfunded vision. Obviously, as with most places, there's far more needs than the funding to implement that. So we do kind of make that distinction, but it's a requirement from the federal perspective that it does be fiscally constrained. And it does address all modes of transportation. So certainly we're looking at capacity on roadways, but we're looking at bike facilities, we're looking at sidewalks and ADA compliance, we're looking at transit, and anything else really that's coming through different technology and micromobility platforms out there. So just a little bit about our outreach schedule for the current 2050 RTP. Before the shutdown occurred, we were able to get out a couple of public meetings. One was our overall visioning meeting, was really what we were seeking community input as a region. That was running concurrently with online survey that we had out, and I'll get kind of into those details in a little bit here. Another is we're also trying to have specific workshops or forums where there was issues that we wanted to kind of address with a little more specifically. One of those was the Sparks and Industrial Road workshop that we held, and this was kind of trying to engage not only community leaders in the city of Sparks, but also a lot of the businesses kind of that area, I would say generally north of I-80 and south of, Prater Way, or yeah, it's probably in that general section there. And looking at Rock Boulevard, Gregg Street, Glendale, a lot of the businesses along that section. We are also fortunate to be able to engage with some of the high school leadership as well as students. There's a Washoe County School District Leadership Council, and there's representatives from each of the high schools. We really want to focus on getting that youth and input into this plan, and really realistically thinking about it. And if the plan is implemented as planned, these are the kids that are going to be adults when we realize this vision in 2050. So we have a couple of upcoming virtual events. We do have an inter-county regional working group that's scheduled to occur on the 27th, as well as kind of an economic development forum. So we're still working out the details on that, but those will be Zoom meetings, so we can engage those groups. Kind of the next step, I mentioned we already had our visioning workshop and survey, so we got some really good, valuable feedback from that, and now we want to start looking at what we're calling alternatives development, so looking at projects, putting them out there, getting public input to see which ones are a priority to the public. We're also going to try to make this process a little more data-driven than it has been in the past. So we have a prioritization framework that we're developing, and I'll get into that in a few minutes as well. And once we've kind of vetted that out with the community, then ultimately we'll come back and present really what our final program is going to be looking at, and try to get some public input on that. And we'll also have some other focus areas up in the North Valleys. We're looking at ways to engage the residents up there, as well as in the downtown Reno area. These are just some needs that we've heard in working with our local agency stakeholders. And so we're really building off our existing 2040 RTP, and a lot of the work that was done from that plan is still relevant. As I mentioned, we have to update this every 4 years. So, you know, by no means do we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, we've made some really good progress on some of the projects that were highlighted in that plan, but there's still work to be done there. So a lot of the information that we get for this plan will kind of be a carryover from that plan. But we've also done kind of on the side some other work at the RTC that looks at specific areas. One of those is the South Meadows study, which was recently completed, generally looking at, because the area, again, this is all pre-pandemic, was experiencing really rapid growth and traffic increase. And so we were looking at ways to see what are some of the short-term and maybe longer-term improvements that we could implement down there to kind of assist with this growth and development. Another one we're looking at is the University Area Study. That is about complete. We're hoping to bring it to our board for approval possibly in June. And this is kind of looking at, you know, what the vision is for the university in that gateway area predominantly. And it's kind of coinciding with a few other projects we have going on, like the extension of our Virginia line, the bus rapid transit, which will go up to serve the university area, and a couple project improvements we're doing on the Oddie Wells area, and how this is all interconnected in what the vision is for the city of Reno and the downtown area. So we're trying to get out ahead of that and facilitate better connectivity really between the university and downtown. We recently completed an ADA transition plan. This was more so on RTC facilities. We have an existing plan that kind of looked at needs on the regional roads, but this plan, it was really looking at our bus stops as well as our buildings and looking at what we need to do to make those more compliant. And currently we are under development with what we're calling the Eagle Canyon Corridor Study. And this is basically looking at a connection between the growing areas of the North Valleys and Spanish Springs. So as I mentioned, public input is very essential and very much a key to this whole process. We kind of re-evaluated our guiding principles in our current plan, and they're on the screen there for you to see, but safe and healthy communities, economic development and diversification, sustainability, and increased travel choices. And we feel these are still very relevant to our region, relevant with kind of the federal highway administration and their goals. And based on the feedback we got, we don't really see much need to alter these. So getting into, again, some other priorities from the existing RTP. I won't read all of these here, but these are kind of what was really driving that plan. Pedestrian safety is paramount. You know, I think a lot of you are familiar with the increase in pedestrian crashes that had occurred, especially with school-aged children in the basically since the beginning of this school year, started back in August. It was kind of unprecedented, the number of crashes we had. Fortunately, most of them were minor, you know, just minor injuries, but there were a couple fatalities, and we really are trying to grapple as a region and how to protect our children and everyone in general, but just seeing what we need to do to elevate the awareness of, you know, our safety needs in the region. As I mentioned, we're working on ADA improvements. Mentioned the BRT as well on Virginia Street. It stands for Bus Rapid Transit. I apologize for any acronyms I throw out there. We are very big partners with NDOT and all the work they're doing, and obviously Spaghetti Bowl is a big need in the region. Affects everyone in their commutes, and so we're partnering with them not only as a planning partner, but offering some financial assistance as well to get those improvements underway. And again, just some of the other projects I touched on already. One that we're very excited about is a Center Street cycle track project. We're looking at that right now, and this would essentially be the first cycle track in the city of Reno. It's basically a separated facility, two-way cycle track that would run up Center Street and kind of connect the southern part of Midtown with downtown Reno. This is something we were evaluating as we were doing our Virginia Street improvements, with the understanding that we couldn't really accommodate bike facilities on Virginia Street. And so this is a safer and probably more desirable alternative. We've worked a lot with the cycle community in developing this. And again, I mentioned the safety improvements. That's really kind of the bottom line in everything that we do is how to make it safer for pedestrians, because we look at them, working with our Vision Zero partners, as the most vulnerable population. So kind of the theory is that if you make the road safer for a pedestrian, who is the most vulnerable user, you improve safety for everyone. And I did mention kind of the ADA improvements that we're doing with our bus stop improvement program. This is something that's a priority of our board. It's great. We do offer a pretty robust transit service, but we have to keep in mind there's the first mile, last mile, and if there's not an accessible way to get to our transit stops, then unfortunately we're not serving all of the population. And oftentimes those are the most vulnerable or the most transit dependent, and so we really need to improve our existing stops. There's a lot to do, but we're kind of taking it chunks at a time and focusing on some of the higher ridership stops to have kind of the biggest bang for our buck. And again, this is just touching on some of the transit services we offer. I was speaking with Fred a little bit before we started this, and with the pandemic, our ridership's down pretty significantly, and so we are hopeful that things will kind of ramp back up. Some routes are actually still performing pretty well. Again, when there's a certain amount of the population that is transit dependent, but another concern is even when things do get back to quote unquote normal, how safe will people feel just riding in a confined space. So one of the slides I don't have is we're starting to expand what we're calling our flex ride service, which is kind of an on-demand curb to curb service that operates in zones. It works almost like an Uber or a Lyft, and basically you can it's accessible via other means, but if you have a smartphone, you can dial up your ride and it'll be there within 15 minutes and drop you off wherever you want within that zone. And it's got a lot of connection points to our existing fixed route services. The other nice thing about that is we're starting to expand that into areas that are typically underserved just because they are farther out, and it's not really economical to provide a fixed route transit service. So we have a service established in Sparks. We're looking at setting one up currently in the North Valleys, and also expanding in Spanish Springs and out by the Verdi Somerset area. In addition to that, we have our RTC VANPOOL program, and I think even this number on the slide is out of date. I believe we have over 200 VANPOOLs operating at the moment. This has been very successful. Most of the recent growth has occurred with our vans going out to the Tri-Center area. So I'm just checking how I'm doing on time here, Fred. So let me know if I start to run over. So I want to get back to kind of our visioning survey that we put out. Excuse me. So that was open for about 2 months. We had about 370 respondents. As I mentioned, we were really looking at kind of the overall vision for our RTP, what the priorities would be in the public eye, and realizing that we do have these competing interests at times, kind of what those trade-offs are, and what would be the preference of the public, having to make some of those tough decisions. We did kind of pose the same visioning question in the survey as we did internally to RTC staff and to our advisory committees. We have an agency working group that meets every other month that we continue to update on the development of the RTP, and it's made up of predominantly other agency stakeholders that we partner with on a regular basis. And then we did present this to the North Valley's Developers Forum we had as well. So on this slide, you can see on the left, there are the, it's a word cloud that was generated off of the responses we received from our survey. On the right is another word cloud that we put together based on kind of the in-person question we asked. And essentially the question was, you know, what are your top three, what's your vision for the RTP, and what's the transportation vision look like for 2050? And we asked people to say it up to 3 words or phrases, you know, whatever they felt would best express that vision. And so, you know, obviously the word clouds do their algorithms, and it's not a perfect method, but the hope or goal out of this exercise is just to see, you know, where there's consensus or what words kind of pop out the most. And so I thought it was really interesting to see that they're very similar, you know, even though it's kind of coming from 2 different groups. Safety was a big one, of course, which is not a surprise. Efficiency, connectivity, and you can see one of the notable differences on our online survey. There's a little more reference to bicycles, bikes, bike facilities, cycling. You know, we didn't quite get that as much on the agency responses. So what this slide shows is the priorities that I was speaking of. So in the survey, participants were given the opportunity to rank up to 5 different priorities. You know, that was a priority to them. Out of these, I believe there's 8 there that were available. And so out of all the people that responded, what this graph shows on the left, starting with bicycle infrastructure, that was the highest rank. So it had the highest rank being number 1. So the closer to number 1 you are, that's the higher the rank. So, and kind of the table on the bottom shows the ranking, but also the counts. So, for example, transportation safety received the 3rd highest rank on average, but was actually selected as an option more than any of the others. But I thought it was an interesting graph. You can see kind of how things ranked. You know, we had one question or one priority being investment in micromobility, which would be like e-bikes, bike share, or scooters, or really anything in that kind of genre or realm, and didn't really rank very high in comparison to some of the other modes. Looking at trade-offs, so we presented 5 different trade-offs. You know, again, this is a multimodal plan. We do want to invest in all modes, but how we do that is kind of open to debate. We can't do it all, obviously. So, for example, this slide shows, well, okay, we want to invest in bike infrastructure, and clearly that's a priority of the public, but how do we do that? You know, do we have bike lanes, which are basically paint on the ground, and we do try to add these wherever we can, especially when we're doing some of our roadway reconstruction or maintenance through our preventative maintenance program or pavement preservation program. We, you know, if there's room available and we're kind of resurfacing, then we can kind of restripe, maybe narrow lanes a little bit, add some bike lanes, maybe some green paint, which has been really successful at some of our busier intersections. But also, you know, alternatively, we could look at doing the buffered facilities similar to what we're talking about on Center Street with the 2-way cycle track. Obviously, that requires a lot more engineering, oftentimes right away, so significantly much more expensive, but the value you get out of that is it's a lot more comfortable for all users, really. Certainly safer, you know, you have that separation between vehicle traffic. So obviously, as indicated in this response, you know, it seems that folks would prefer to have the kind of separated, safer lanes or safer infrastructure as opposed to maybe the more extensive bike lanes that are striped but don't really provide the same level of comfort. Similarly with sidewalks, actually kind of the opposite. People just want basic sidewalks. They want to be able to connect from here to there. They want the connectivity. You know, they're not really interested in amenities, maybe street trees or street furniture or what have you. You know, it's more of a utilitarian approach. And so we frame this category as efficiency, realizing that, you know, when you do kind of slow traffic down, you don't always get the throughput that you would on the higher speed road. So on the left, you see roadway capacity kind of supporting that efficient throughput. And on the right, you see looking at, you know, more multimodal roadways, perhaps with lower speeds, slowing things down a little bit, but, you know, you get more of a safety benefit out of that. So that was clearly the winner in this category as well. And then looking at our roadways, again, with new capacity, I mean, expanding the roadway network or really focusing our investment on preserving what we have, the pavement preservation seemed to win out on this one. And lastly, looking at transit, this was, for me, it was the most interesting, just because you could see it's pretty even across the board. And we posed the trade-off as, do you want to improve the existing transit core we have, and maybe increase frequency or, you know, invest more into stop amenities? Or should we expand to some of these outlying areas where transit doesn't exist right now? And so again, it was fairly kind of even across the board there. And I think we are able, as I mentioned earlier, with the flex ride service, that we are able to kind of accommodate both of these desires. It seems that the microtransit, which is the flex ride, is really able to accomplish the service that's needed in those outlying areas and kind of loop them into the rest of the system. And so you're probably wondering a little bit about, you know, who are these respondents that participated, and hopefully some of you did on the Zoom meeting as well. But you know, we asked people where they live, and overwhelmingly, well, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly, but the largest category was in downtown Reno. And I will caveat this by saying, you know, we kind of just threw out these descriptive geographies. There wasn't a map saying, you know, this is where I live. I'm associated with this, you know, certain neighborhood or whatever. So it was kind of self-identified by the respondents. And so you can kind of see the breakdown there. Bill Thomas, our executive director, asks, you know, this is great information, but, you know, what's the actual population in these areas compared to how folks responded? Which I thought was a great question. So we did a little analysis. I don't have it here right now, but for the most part, it was actually fairly consistent with kind of the population distribution. The downtown Reno is where the biggest mismatch was. As you can imagine, there was the percentage of people that live in downtown Reno in the region is much smaller than 30%. But overall, it wasn't too dissimilar. And the other kind of surprise, given the amount of desire for multimodal improvements and bicycle infrastructure, still which isn't really, I guess, that surprising, still the overwhelming response for primary mode of transportation was in a personal vehicle, people that drove alone. So you can kind of see the breakdown there, although there is definitely a strong representation from the cycling community on this. So taking all that information, now that we're about to enter into our project screening process, we want to do it in a more data-driven approach, as I mentioned. And so we're looking at certain criteria, measuring all projects equally to inform the decision-making process. It doesn't mean if, you know, it has a score, a certain rank, like that's what we're doing. You know, we obviously are bringing this out to the public and to our board for their input, but it just helps inform that and maybe put some context around how we select those projects. So one of the criteria we're looking at is, again, safety. As I mentioned, it's very much a priority for the RTC. In terms of this metric, we're looking at crash frequency, rate, and severity. So crashes per mile or per unit of distance. We're looking at the number of crashes that occur on a certain stretch of roadway, and also severity. So was it just a property damage only, or was it a fatality? So those ones that are worse get a higher rating. And so we do kind of a composite of all those scores. We're looking at congestion, and we have kind of decided to update this particular measure a little bit. Before, we were just looking at what's called the level of service based on our travel demand model for existing traffic, which would be 2020. Now we're also kind of providing equal weight to forecasted traffic volumes as well. So looking, what it would be in 2040, for example. We do have an existing bicycle and pedestrian master plan. And in that plan, we have a very kind of data-driven approach for ranking specifically bicycle and pedestrian projects. So we've kind of translated that process onto this as well, and to see, how these projects line up with that plan. And so these are just some of the things we're looking at, like, is it network connectivity, proximity to transit, or essential services like grocery stores, that sort of thing. Looking at our payment condition, we're actually pretty fortunate to have really good payment in our region, but we are looking at that as a criteria as well. We evaluate that through what's called the Payment Condition Index, or PCI. It's basically a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being brand new and 0 being gravel. Basically, it's degraded so bad. So I don't have it up here. I think our average PCI is around 80. I have to fact check that, but overall it's a really good shape though. And then something new we're incorporating, the Truckee Meadows Regional Planning Agency recently adopted their regional plan, and we worked really closely with them throughout that development. And one of the things they're looking at is this kind of tiered land use system. So you can see in this map, kind of the dark blue is the mixed use core, and then the core kind of radiates out. And so any projects we are proposing, where they're located geographically within the system, determines the scoring it gets. So something that's in the core would get a higher score than something that's, say, in a tier 2 or tier 3 land use. And the reason for that is, and the whole reason TMRPA proposed this system, was that the idea that, you want to target investment where there's relatively existing services available. It just makes more financial sense to support that. And you're looking for obviously higher densities in, the urban core and that sort of thing. So where that type of development is appropriate. And so we wanted to incorporate their land use system in with our evaluation to kind of marry those two plans together. Other criteria we're looking at that's not quite as heavily weighted as the first 5 I went through, but still important and relevant. Looking at any flood mitigation needs, project readiness. So is the project ready to be constructed tomorrow, or is there a fair amount of design that needs to happen still, and maybe environmental work? Whether or not there's other agency funding or private funding to help support it. And of course, again, getting back to our public and agency input. So next steps, as I mentioned, we're kind of entering our project development phase, and we'll apply this prioritization to it. Once we've got a good set of projects that's been reviewed by our board and the public, we are then going to populate our travel demand model. And basically this just looks at the projects and evaluate, how it performs in terms of congestion and air quality, and assuming that we do meet transportation conformity, we'll begin to draft our document actually concurrently when the other processes are going on, and then ultimately looking for board approval. And so that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I believe Amy Cummings, the Director of Planning, might be on the line as well. So I'd invite her to chime in too. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan, very much for a very comprehensive presentation and an overview of the 2050 RTP. We have about 20 or so minutes left on our clock for today. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or insights they'd like to share with Dan and the group?
Fred, this is Michael Johnson.
Go ahead, Mike.
Dan, you did a really nice job. When you were talking about, ridership's down, of course, because of the situation right now. Are we also, when it's up, how close does it pay for itself, or just some routes do pay for themselves and yet others don't? I wasn't so sure about that because I don't actually live in Reno.
No worries. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Someone once explained it to me like this, and I think it was a good analogy. So we kind of view transit as a public service, like you would a library or something like that. So most transit systems do not pay for themselves. Really, it's something we provide, as I mentioned, that, it kind of serves a population that is transit dependent, that might not have a car, or maybe a viable way to get to employment. And so really, I'll have to go back and double check, but I don't know that any of our routes necessarily pay for themselves. But obviously, we get federal funding to implement that, and then we provide a match through sales tax. So we are able to provide that service, if that helps.
Yeah, it's kind of like, tennis courts and basketball courts. I call them lost leaders. You have to provide those for people, but you're not really making any money off the tennis courts that you put in or the basketball courts. They're there for the public's use, and in turn, the public pays for them through their taxes and stuff.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think you're muted, Fred. Hey, Fred, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that, Dan. And sorry to everyone. Dan, we have a question in the chat group. How will the RTC prioritize its investments in the new regional transportation plan with the growth tiers in the new regional plan?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it is under consideration when we do this prioritization process. So it does have a weighting. And I don't have those weightings. I didn't make those available for everyone, but safety is probably our highest weighting. I think we put about, I don't know, I think we're looking at a total of like 125 points or so. It's not a nice, not round number, but we put about 35 points on safety weighting. The other ones, for the most part, actually, I think I have this pulled up here, are about 20 to 15. So the land use priority is a pretty high weighting compared to all of the criteria, but not the highest. And I don't know if that really answers the question, but could you repeat it one more time? I just want to make sure I'm getting to the heart of it.
How will the RTC prioritize its investments in the new regional transportation plan with the growth tiers in the new regional plan?
Okay. The only other thing I want to add to that is what we try to do in terms of our plan is not only, distribute investments geographically. So we're trying to be as equitable as possible, but also across modes as well. So, and there's obviously economies of scale there, but, we don't want to just be kind of a road building agency. We want to invest in our transit system. We want to invest in sidewalks. We want to invest in bicycle facilities. So trying to kind of spread that funding across all modes and also throughout the region, and not just have it all targeted, you know, like in the downtown, for example. Certainly, I think there are some, you know, economies of scale realized, as which I think TMRPA is really getting at, was we have facilities available and infrastructure available kind of in the more dense areas as opposed to areas that might be more of considered urban sprawl. But still, I mean, the growth is happening out there, and we need to provide for those communities as well. Definitely.
Looks like Art Rangel, you had a question regarding bike lanes.
I do. Thanks, Dan, for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I love riding road bikes in the greater Reno area at great big shoulders and whatnot. The question I have has to do with some of the roadways, the bike areas are rather rough. As an example, going out Mayberry, like I live right downtown Reno, going out Mayberry under and 4th Street under the freeway and then out to Verdi. When you get out in the Verdi area, it seems like the surface changes a bit, it gets smoother. I don't know if that's NDOT that maintains that or whom, but is there any thought given to trying to, at least in the bike lane, to a surface that may be a little bit better?
Sure, yeah, and you did kind of touch on one point there. A lot of times roadways like that do transition into different jurisdictions, so they could be maintained differently. As the kind of pavement preservation purveyor of the regional roads, we try to apply consistent treatment throughout on those roads. Okay. But we do not, however, do like kind of routine maintenance like street sweeping or that sort of thing. So that's really more up to the local jurisdictions. And, you know, as we kind of go through this pavement preservation program, it's somewhat on a cycle. So, you know, a road might not get touched for several years because overall pavement condition is pretty good. Eventually, though, it does come back around. And so when we do address it, we kind of update it to whatever standards, you know, the latest standards that there are at the time, and try to do that in a consistent manner. So in some of those cases, it might just be that there hasn't been a need for maintenance. And so it's kind of the way it is, but eventually we'll be, you know, getting back around to that and seeing what the best kind of treatment we can provide.
It's just an FYI, because those are very heavily traveled roadways out there, and it's not a big deal. I mean, it still works, but some places, and it's not a, well, it is a resurfacing issue, really.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.